Okay, so second video, range and density is the next kind of sort of applicable idea that I was going to talk about. What do we mean by that? Range, basically referring to the spread of pitch that you can employ. So it's quite easy to get focused down, especially if we're kind of utilizing a more localized set of positions to get stuck down in one point and your whole part to sit in the same area. Obviously, fretboard knowledge is really valuable with this kind of stuff, being able to voice stuff in multiple places across the fretboard, and knowing where you are and what notes are around you is obviously going to unlock a whole lot of that. And that is really good. There's all sorts of ways of looking at that and teaching, and the caged system stuff is probably the most common that I tend to come across. And I think that is another thing that's covered in the Musicademy courses. So there's lots of good stuff in the electric courses for developing cage system kind of thing, fretboard knowledge, knowing how to voice things. But for these ideas of sort of general application, I've sort of come up with ways of approaching it which don't require you to go away and learn a whole lot of new positions, but so you can start applying these things to stuff that you're already comfortable and you already know. So in terms of pitch variation, obviously you tend to think laterally in terms of across the fretboard. In terms of pitch, where you want higher parts, they're up here, and if you want lower parts, they're down here. But there'll obviously be a lot of choice across the strings with your existing shapes. I have a different set of pitches within that one shape by making selections across the strings. So there's already more maybe than is instinctive to kind of expect in terms of pitch options in a shape we already have. So string choices can be good. Again, as we've mentioned in the previous video, this is the fundamental thing that people often talk about when it comes to range, is kind of being aware of where everything else is sitting. So it's the kind of looking up with the ears thing. Again, obviously when we're writing parts and playing parts on the fly kind of thing, it's important to kind of see where other instruments are, particularly the keys when it comes to being a guitar player, so you're not just all inhabiting the same kind of pitch range. So if you're using one chord, if we go right down to here, and the keys are doing something up high, it's good to be aware of that and make choices that are somewhat lower, and vice versa. So that's always a really important element, and by choosing to kind of fill in areas around other parts, you can, you're effectively adding shade and character to parts of the people playing, like we mentioned with leaving space around people's parts in the previous video. But just some more practical things about playing the guitar itself. Obviously pitch can mirror the feel of the moment and the intention of the song. So it's quite effective if you want to create contrast between a verse and a chorus to move where you're playing, and that could be, for example, your higher bits. I'm just basically using sort of standard arpeggios there. When the chorus comes in, changing your range down to here. These are all quite simple premises, but effectively, zero in mind if you want to do it that way. There's a lot of effect that making those choices will have on the song itself. Obviously, this is all entirely dependent on context, and sometimes you've got an area where it's going to drop down in dynamic, but going low can be quite good. There's a lot of tracks you hear a part, a guitar part somewhere down here. I'm just literally selecting, if I put the full chord shapes down, but I'm literally just playing the one note off the bottom of the chord or the root. There's a lot to be had from selecting the range. Even if you're within your same chord shapes that you're beginning, you can start to create contrast and flow within the part you're doing. A couple of examples that are kind of typical, rising pitch can be really effective in creating a build So contrast is always very effective if you've got to build into a chorus or something. The difference between, even taking would take scaling elements out, but even just within adding some rhythm parts to, that's obviously fairly derivative in terms of doing exactly what you expect as I say that, but you can see that it creates the rise in pitch mirrors the crescendo in the dynamic, and so that kind of element can be really effective. And a typical kind of way to go, obviously heavier parts or big moments, lower pitch parts create a lot of body and weight behind things, and high pitch parts can create a lot of air below them, a lot of kind of space. So I'm just sticking to the same parts, or that is a very different part from playing, creating some space. So it's worth thinking about where you're choosing to put your parts as well, before it even comes down to expanding note choices and finding common tones and all sorts of things you can do with lots of different elements. Those examples I just played there are all within the same chord shapes that I'm applying from that previous example. So range and then density, which I've kind of touched on with that example, by which I kind of mean how much of the chord you're choosing to put. So that obviously, as we said at the beginning, the idea is to kind of apply principles to what you've already got. So if your set of shapes that are available to you in your current knowledge are those bar chords, like so, for the example progression, you can get a lot out of them by choosing how much of those to put down. So I'm going to try and, as I do this, remember to put the whole shape down to make the point. But there's a difference between playing this and obviously one. So it's always worth a lot of parts you hear on records are following through the chord changes, but with quite limited selections of notes. So you can look at single notes, you can look at two notes, which generally would be called a double stop, or three notes, which would generally be called a triple stop. So starting to consider how dense your chords are is a really effective way. So, for example, if we approach that example progression, so that was me checking the delay time, and I'll keep these whole chords down. There's a difference between a part. Say we're going to just arpeggiate bits. Selecting two notes from the chord, we can expand the phrase, the spread of the melody. So 3 notes being utilised there. Same thing for playing more rhythmic parts. Double stops, triple stops, and obviously single notes. You'll quite often hear on records that there's a part somewhere that's often holding a kind of rhythmically focused note. So there's a wide spectrum that can be applied. If you've got a big chord, we can combine pitch and density. So low and thick is a lot bigger than low and thinner in terms of the voicing. The same applies to kind of higher pitch stuff. One very briefly did there with the lower stuff is common tones are a great thing to look at and really frequently used in church stuff. So, notes that are consistent across the chords. So in the case of this progression, you'll find a G in every single chord in the progression. Leaning on those common tones is really effective, and also then leads into common tones, things that create suspensions that can be held across different voicings, and that you'll hear a lot of, and I would recommend going and having a look at some courses, the electric course and things, on starting to create more fretboard knowledge, more scale knowledge, which starts to unlock voice leading and voicings for chords, and will allow you to start to understand where those common threads are, and that in itself, combined with the density thing, starts to create common tones across 3 or 4 notes, or 2 notes, or even 1 note that runs through. Is a very effective way to combine the two. Cool, so that is range and density. Again, I hope that made sense. And we will move on to number 3 next time.